My question is, so why do people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and other progressives talk as if they are not aware or don't understand MMT to use it to help us, we the people's advantage?
Politicians are not either very good at public education or they lack the right context to do the kind of public education that would be required to change this. Part of the goal of creating a large social movement like MMT is trying to do is to change it from the ground up. That's the world that we have to change. We can't rely on these singular politicians to do the heavy lifting of educating people. If you look at, for example, Obama, I'm sure, did not hate gay people, but he was not the leader in pushing for LGBTQ rights. He didn't make it a pitch for him. And when the ground shifted in his view enough, of course he was for it. But he was not in a position to have that uncomfortable conversation with his family member that millions of Americans did to get prevailing attitudes to where they needed to be.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard Modern Money Network President Rohan Gray, and in a moment we're going to be hearing Rohan answer questions posed by readers of The Deficit Myth, Stephanie Kelton's groundbreaking bestseller, at a book club event hosted by Ramona Massachi of Real Progressives. In the show notes, I've linked to where you can see video of this event and to where you can follow and financially support the work of Real Progressives. They're a team of volunteers doing incredible work, so please help out if you can. If you're new to MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes where we talk through the basics, or listen to our Unpacking the Deficit Myth series. We also have an episode with Stephanie Kelton, that's our episode 90, but if you've already read or are in the process of reading The Deficit Myth, the following Q&A is a great way to consolidate on the ideas introduced in the book. The chapter under discussion, entitled Don't Think of a Household, introduces the reader to the idea that the government isn't like any other entity in the economy when it comes to the money we use. In fact, the government is in the opposite position to the rest of us. They issue the currency and we use it. And what follows from that is that when the government spends in deficit, i.e. it spends more than it collects in taxes, the non-government, that would include you and me, the non-government sector gets the surplus that deficit creates. Every deficit has to have a corresponding surplus, and so the government's deficit is the private sector's surplus. And so arguing to reduce the government's deficit is the same as arguing to reduce the wealth of the private sector. Now, one could argue that a certain fraction of the private sector could do with having their wealth reduced for social equity purposes, but anybody living in the real world knows that that's never where the spending cuts or the tax increases are targeted. And so my personal feeling is that I can't recall an example of where arguing for deficit reduction wasn't just another way of arguing for austerity. Professor Kelton has said elsewhere that she would prefer that people understood that headlines about trillion-dollar deficits were actually headlines about trillion-dollar surpluses, as far as the readers of those headlines, all currency users, were concerned. And so the book is aimed at correcting these obvious and tired media distortions about what the term government deficit actually means. In the following Q&A, a question comes up about government bond issuance, and we have a 2-part interview with Dr. Stephen Hale on that topic. That's our episodes 30 and 31, where we go into more detail about how it works and why it shouldn't really be called borrowing, and how the secondary bond market is something that central banks use to achieve target interest rates rather than to raise revenue to fund the government. A lot of other things come up in the conversation, including the Mint the Coin initiative, which Rohan worked on with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and the conversation touches on other MMT writing and resources, so I've linked to all of those in the show notes, where, as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month, which is 72 British pence at the time of recording. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We are 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT, and thanks again to Ramona, Virginia, Steve, and all the rest of the hardworking team at Real Progressives. Let's dive in.
My name is Ramona Massachi. I learned about MMT through the Bernie Sanders campaign. I wanted to understand his economic platform, and I found Stephanie Kelton, and I started reading her work, and I started reading other economists' work that were colleagues of hers. Our guest, Rohan Gray, is an assistant professor of law at Willamette University, the president of Modern Money Network, and a director of the National Jobs for All Network. Would you like to ask your question?
Has there ever been a push to try to come with new words instead of deficit and debt? I don't know if that's even a good question. That's what I've been thinking for months now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing would be that I think Stephanie would agree that words matter. And, you know, she likes to call herself a student of George Lakoff, who was very famously wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant. And it was about the power of framing in politics and the way that we choose language. So I think, you know, you can look, as you'll see later in this book, for example, there's points where she talks about treasury debt as a form of money and says, you know, we can think of US dollars as green dollars and treasury securities as yellow dollars. And people like Warren Mosler have written in what he called the great reframing, that to call government securities a form of interest earning money. And I say that, you know, pretty regularly as well. The word deficit is a little bit harder because it is a technical term. There are other words. I mean, we will often say spending in excess of tax receipts or something like that. And, you know, we often say, for example, instead of taxes or tax revenue, we'll say tax offsets to be clear that it's not money coming in, it's just offsetting the spending. So I think there is an important role for that kind of semantic advocacy. That said, there are technical terms that have meanings. You know, asset and debt are technical terms that are accurate descriptions. Even, you know, money is a debt, as people like Randy Ray would say. So right. The word debt there, you know, on one hand, we want to try to reclaim that word or at least help people understand what it means so that whenever they hear it, they don't have that boogeyman, while at the same time trying to understand, you know, the importance of semantic framing wherever we can. So I think, you know, the bigger challenge, I think, is to have judgment in when you fight those fights. You know, there are people who will be talking in a technical room and then lay people will come in and say, well, actually, it's not the deficit, it's this thing. And it's not that they're wrong or that their intervention doesn't make sense in a broader context, but it's not reading the room, it's not reading that moment and the right thing to do. So I think the question is less, is this a good idea or not? Should we be pushing this or not? But where are the contexts where it makes sense to do that? And where are the contexts where it makes sense to use the technical language because either everybody in the room understands that it doesn't have that other emotional valency or because it's just not the right moment to fight that semantic argument. There's no right answer on that, but I think that's probably the bigger, more challenging question is not should we fight on semantics, but when is it worth fighting on semantics?
Thank you so much. And the next question is from my friend Jason Call, who's running for Congress in Washington 02. Jason, would you like to ask the question?
I would love to. Thank you, Ramona. Good to see you. Rohan, thank you so much. So I asked, how do we counter the oft presented trope that we're in debt to China or the Saudis and that these foreign government owns our debt and could take over our national assets? I hear this all the time. And I did go and look, thank you, Rob Baxter, at the YouTube explanation from Warren Mosler. But I'm wondering if you can, put that in layman's terms and let us know how to counter that argument when we're out on the streets.
So there's the narrow argument from an MMT point of view, which is the relevant part of the story is not the one that most people think. The relevant part of the story is why did another country accumulate US dollars in the first place? And I'll get to that in a second. But once they've accumulated US dollars, it's a no-brainer for them to invest that in a safe interest-earning asset like Treasury securities or Treasury debt. So when people say, oh, well, the government has borrowed China, we're borrowing from China and stuff, you can immediately shut that down by explaining that a Treasury security is not borrowing something. It's that China had funds and then they invested those funds in something. The question that's actually underneath that, the more important question, is why did China accumulate those assets in the first place? And there's a number of different reasons why different actors around the world want to hold US dollars and to accumulate those dollars. But at a really basic level, the US dollar is the global reserve currency, and there are military bases around the world. A lot of international financial contracts are denominated in US dollars. It's a very safe asset and a good hedge against any domestic risk. And a lot of actors will want to accumulate those dollars because they're on the other side of trade with the United States. China likes to be an exporter. That's part of its goal. It likes to keep its currency at a level where it isn't appreciating too much against the US dollar. So I think the idea of kind of why would we sell stuff to China, or why would China want to accumulate dollars in other contexts, is not the question that most people are worried about when they're worried about borrowing from China. They're thinking about national debt. So I would start with that narrow response, explaining that then we're not borrowing anything from China, but I would do so with the knowledge that the actually more important question is getting into this much more messy world of international finance. And there really isn't a simple answer for that. There are reasons why trade surpluses and things happen, but actually most of the international financial flows are not to do with trade flows. They're to do with financial capital flows and things like that, which don't map neatly onto the story that people like Warren Moser like to tell, which is true in its own sense, but limited, which is, we give them green pieces of paper or digital equivalents and they give us cars and sweat and labor. That's true for trade. It's not true for the financial flows on top. And there are situations where it might be a bad thing to have 50% of the overall amount of currency and U.S. treasuries in circulation held by foreign actors. But again, it's important to be clear. The risk there is not that they will suddenly buy up half the United States and the United States won't have any way to do anything about that. The U.S. controls its own legal system. If they don't want foreigners to buy up companies and land, they can just pass laws to do that. That might piss people off who accumulated those dollars, but it's not something that the U.S. is ever going to run out of the ability to control its own borders and the resources in those borders. So I think it's a complicated question, and it gets into a lot of really interesting questions. But at a very basic level, you can dispel that by explaining that we're not borrowing anything from them. They accumulated dollars, and then they're storing those dollars as savings.
Thank you for answering that. Patrick would like to ask a question.
First of all, Ramona, thank you, and Rohan, thank you for coming on and helping us out today. Really appreciate it. So my question is mainly because I know that you have an interest in Bitcoin and digital currency. And so what I'm wondering is, first of all, since my understanding is those currencies are not created by the federal government, how do those fit in with the ideas of MMT? And then kind of a secondary question is, does this mean that the states could create their own currency? And do you think this would be a good idea?
Yeah, so on the first question, I think, and this is an important clarification or thing to be clear about, especially when you're getting the start of Stephanie's book, which is she talks a lot about the US government being the monopoly issuer of the US dollar, but it's not the monopoly issuer of money more broadly. There are a lot of entities that create various things that circulate in some way as money. And Stephanie would be the first to tell you that because she takes a lot of her learning from Hyman Minsky, who famously said, as Randy Ray likes to quote often, anyone can create money. The challenge is to get it accepted. So different kinds of money circulate with more or less, degree of acceptance. Public money and public currency has a unique theory of why it gets accepted over others, and it has a very special place in the hierarchy of monies because it is hierarchical. And in that respect, the value proposition of Bitcoin is nothing like the value proposition of a public currency, or a currency, even a private money denominated in a public unit of account. It's its own private unit of account as well as its own private instrument. And if you want to understand the difference there, I could create my own currency called Rohan bucks, but they would be, if they were denominated in US dollars, then that would still be using the US unit of account. So I could create a private money denominated in the US unit of account. Bitcoin is both a private money and a private unit of account. So it's neither here nor there to MMT theory. There have been private currencies and complementary private currencies alongside public currencies for thousands of years. And there's a reason why they're not usually the most important currencies in those communities or societies. And I think that's what MMT would help you understand why, it's not, at least in my opinion, worth spending much time on those kinds of instruments. To your second point, one of the reasons why Bitcoin isn't very good is because it doesn't really have a real community behind it. It has a bunch of people who are speculators. It has a bunch of people who believe they're going to create a community without politics. The Winklevoss twins famously said when they invested in Bitcoin in the early 2010s that they had elected to put their faith in something that was free of politics and human error, in mathematics, which is absolutely ridiculous because Bitcoin is comprised of real people making real decisions about their code and about the computers that the system runs on. So it isn't free of humans and free of politics and all that kind of stuff. It's not just pure mathematics. It is its own community. It's just a very sort of sociopathic or antisocial community. But there are other communities that can have a very real value proposition for their own currencies. It might not be as comprehensive as a public currency, but it can be real. And MMTers will talk, for example, about the Buckaroo currency at UMKC, where they issue this currency that people can use to get grades in their economics classes and things like that. And there have been other currencies. I lived in Ithaca, New York. The Ithaca Hours currency is one of the most famous complementary currencies in the United States, where you get these currency for performing an hour of community service, and then you could get it accepted at local stores. I wrote a small accessible article called Monetary Resilience, where I made the case that there's a really important role for nested currencies. You could have federal currency, state currency, local currency, and that is a valuable way to increase fiscal space at the state and local level. And it's also a way to encourage pluralism and resilience in an economy, so that, if you had New Yorkers who are investing some fraction of their money in New York bucks, that's a way to keep some value circulating within the New York economy and to give New York as a state or as a city some control over its budget process beyond what it can borrow or get in taxes. How significant that will be relative to the US dollar really depends on the jurisdiction, depends on the people involved. But there is definitely a role for that, and it can play an important role in complementing whatever the public currency is. There's a very famous advocate of complementary currencies named Bernard Lieta, who passed away a few years ago. But he famously used to analogize this to the difference between monocultural farming and biocultural diversity. If you have a single crop on farmland, it's much more fragile than if you have a permaculture with a lot of different mutually reinforcing. Even if there's one primary crop, having those others there can create a more resilient ecosystem. So I think there is a role for state currencies, yes, and we've been working on that in various contexts, and we'll continue to work on that. And actually, in March, worked with a number of city aldermen in Chicago to put out a request for the federal government to provide more support to cities and states, but also included that cities and states should issue their own currency, and the Fed should purchase that using a swap line network, similar to how they do with propping up foreign currencies. If you can have swap lines with other countries, you can have swap lines with New York and Arizona.
Would the Fed and Congress be open to that?
Which Fed? No. I mean, not unless they were hit by a bus and reelected with a different group of people, probably not. But technically, they can do that. I mean, it's something worth considering and advocating for, and it's certainly something that I think leans into the best parts of a federated system. A lot of states' rights and all that kind of stuff is just white supremacist bullshit. But to the extent that there are state and local units of government and they are different communities, then this is a way to advocate for change at that level, even while pushing for change at the federal level.
That would be fantastic. That would make me very happy. So Lana Dell has a question. Lana, would you like to ask your question?
Stephanie briefly touched on PAYGO. And the recent brouhaha over the squads trading their votes for Pelosi has something to do with the different pay-go rules that are temporary. But I wondered if you would be kind enough to give us some, insight into what those pay-go rule changes could mean for us.
Yeah, I mean, pay-go has been a huge problem for progressive legislation for a very long time, and it's to do with the way that bills get scored and the way that they get passed, and typically pay-go is required spending to basically be revenue neutral. Or to be spending, cost neutral on the budget over a certain horizon. And so in order to put any spending program out there, you have to identify sort of ways in which you will recoup those costs somewhere else. And what that does is reinforce the taxpayer money myth. It reinforces the sort of need that budgets have to be offset 100% for spending with taxes. It reinforces the idea that sort of, that there's no room for basically deficit politics at all. And it's been something that the Democrats have been aggressively holding on to for a very, very long time, going back to when the Republicans successfully painted them as fiscally irresponsible. It was their way of showing that they were responsible. It's sort of like somebody accuses you of being too generous on your kids, so you start publicly whipping them as to proof that you sort of go so far to the other side to just be a caricature of yourself. But they've been reluctant to give it up for a very long time. And so, even in the middle of everything going on in 2016, people like Nancy Pelosi refused to even reconsider pay-go at all. And to get them to move on that, even in a temporary way, is which once you open the door temporarily, you open the door more generally because you've conceded the principle that it's okay to do this. But to get that movement is a precondition for any large ambitious spending. And someone like Nancy Pelosi is not stupid when it comes to negotiating and understanding how to use her political capital. And so it was not going to be cheap to get that changed. And the fact that people managed to get that changed, in my opinion, is a very impressive victory from within a party that is otherwise hostile to that kind of thing. But you can ask Stephanie directly about that, or you can read her other writing about this. But I believe it was David Dian who wrote an article called "CBO: Congress's Biggest Obstacle," and it's these kinds of procedural things are where a lot of big ambitious spending programs go to die, and it's sort of less sexy and less fun to sort of think about how you actually change a whole caucus's opinion on these kinds of things. But the fact that the squad got that is, I think, is an incredible coup.
I agree. Alexander has a question.
So my question was just one about general praxis. And so that is, to what extent should activists rely on analogies and storytelling versus presenting and encouraging analysis of how the monetary system actually functions? So what I mean is, it's easy to make someone's head spin by delving into the intricacies of treasury tax and loan accounts, for instance. But on the other hand, a simple money story relying solely on business card analogies can be laughed off by alluding to, quote unquote, the complexity of the real world. So I'm interested if you, Rohan, have any general insight on this from your years of experience communicating these questions at the Modern Money Network.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so I grew up from a family of early childhood educators. We worked with little kids, teaching them how to read music and those kinds of things. And I taught at daycare and elementary school, and now I teach at a law school. And so anyone from my law school classes will tell you, I love using analogies. I love using colorful metaphors and, often outrageous ones to make the point. But I think the real challenge here is to be versatile and to sort of be able to speak in different codes. I taught at an African-American school in Harlem in New York, and the term in those kinds of education circles was code switching. You can speak one way to your family and your community, you can speak another way when you need to. And the important point is to not have any one way of speaking control you, but to make it sort of part of a palette of choices. And you can think of this even playing music. You can sound like you're playing jazz or classical music or whatever else. And the important thing is to be flexible and to be able to do what the moment requires. And so I think if you haven't had the experience talking in a way that's accessible, you should be practicing that. But if the only experience you have is talking in those analogies and metaphors, and if someone actually asks you to sort of write the technical analysis, you wouldn't be able to do it, then that's what you should be working on practicing. And there are spaces to practice that and to sort of try your hand out at articulating it that way. Certainly lawyers like me use analogies and hypotheticals and metaphors all the time, but we do so in order to elucidate complex technical ideas, and that ability to immediately switch from the analogy or the metaphor back into the specific language of the statute or whatever it is very important. Otherwise, the whole thing just becomes kids nursery rhymes. So I think that it might be unhelpful, but I don't think the answer is one or the other. I think the answer is you should be fluent in both, and you should practice both, and you shouldn't be using one as a crutch for the other. And as long as you're doing that, the question of what the right moment to use one or the other will be a judgment call, and comes with experience and comes with listening to who you're talking to and those kinds of things. And there are points where the technical, you might want to start with a lot of dazzling technical knowledge until people are convinced that you know what you're talking about. And then you can sound as silly as you want, because nobody's going to second guess that you know what you're talking about. But if you can't explain what a Eurodollar is, or you can't explain how global swap line networks work, you all should be, as I think Real Progressive does a great job of encouraging people, you should all be learning. And there's always more technical layers. That's part of the reason MMT has been so successful, is because it has teched up millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people that otherwise didn't have access or felt like they had the right to learn the technical nuances. And so, to turn around and start teaching others is important, but you want to be empowering them with the technical knowledge as much as sort of helping them understand it through the right rhetoric.
Ramona, may I say something? Rohan referred to educating ourselves. And I told Sherry I would mention wecanhavethings.com, which has great beginning MMT information. Also, realprogressives.org has information at all levels, and Modern Money Network. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. So Bakari has a question.
My question was, we assume that the federal government or the Fed's federal payroll taxes take away money from the states, in the sense that when people are taxed at the federal level, that means they can't spend, that's money taken away from the states where they could be spending. Do you think the federal payroll taxes should be reduced so people have more spending power? It seems to me it's kind of, I understand the notion of having taxes, but it seems to me if we reduce taxes for certain levels of income, it will give people more spending power. And I know conservatives have been saying that for years, but now that I read about MMT, it kind of, I'm kind of wondering if we should kind of rethink that whole tax thing.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. The first thing is, I don't think it really makes sense of thinking of federal taxes as taking away money from states in particular. It takes money out of circulation. Money out of circulation might mean less money going to states because there's less economic activity that otherwise would be taxed by states that would then form tax revenue. So it's not that you're wrong, but I wouldn't want to think of it in that kind of immediate, the money that was going to payroll taxes could have gone to the states. The money that went to payroll taxes could have stayed in people's pockets, and the more money that stays in people's pockets and circulates might lead to more economic activity that leads to more tax revenue. That said, your second quick point I think is definitely true. I don't think that one of the things I think is valuable from an MMT point of view is it allows us to start from first principles and say, why are we taxing in the first place? What are the right kinds of taxes we want to impose on people? And I don't know if you were starting from that point, if you would end up with something that looks at all like the payroll tax on either side. In many respects, it's very regressive. It's a tax on maybe the kind of economic activity we actually want to see rather than the kind that we don't. And it isn't necessarily well targeted, and it doesn't necessarily help inequality the way that it's currently designed. A lot of it was designed particularly to create a broad tax base that would then have a political vested interest in preserving social security programs, which might have made sense at a certain point in time, but I don't think is actually an accurate description of how those politics work today. Those trust funds are often called broke. We were always debating whether entitlements should be cut, and I don't think I paid my taxes into them is the major reason why most people want to keep them. They want to keep them because they know they work and they like the benefits. So I think if you're going to redesign the tax system, or if you're going to promote tax reform, eliminating a lot of those payroll taxes might be a very smart idea. I would be careful about saying that means conservatives are right, because I don't think conservatives give a shit about reducing taxes on the poor. I think conservatives give a shit about reducing taxes on the rich most of the time. And they have had plenty of chances throughout the last however many years of passing tax cuts to pass tax cuts that disproportionately hit the poor, and they don't do it. That's not their priority. Their priority is reducing the top marginal tax rate for millionaires and those kinds of things. They're not trying to put, if they wanted to have no taxes on anyone below $50,000, it would have happened already. They don't. It's not the goal. So I think it is right to say that taxes are a drag on economic activity. That's sort of part of the point. It's fine. I think it's right to say that certain taxes are badly designed and regressive, and removing those would probably help people. But always, we need to be looking at what the distributional effects are. Because for every dollar we tax one place, we could be taxing it somewhere at a better place, or we could be achieving the same effect that we're trying to achieve with that tax from somewhere else.
Is it possible for the federal government to take on the taxes that we spend on school tax? Because my school taxes are very high. And would the federal government be able to take that on?
Yeah, and this is a really interesting question, really interesting issue, because there's been a long history of weaponizing the idea that it's taxpayers' money as an excuse for not changing this local funding model of school education. And the book to read on this, and the person to speak to about this, is Camille Walsh. She has a book called Racial Taxation, and it's about how conservatives who are opposed to desegregation weaponize the taxpayer money narrative to say, well, we don't want our tax money in this school district funding that black school in that other tax district. And that was actually defended at a constitutional level. So there's constitutional doctrine that will need to be changed, and it will need to be changed by explicitly challenging the presumption, the assumption of taxpayer money that's baked into constitutional jurisprudence right now. But the short answer is there's nothing technically preventing it, and constitutional law is a function of what 9 justices decided is at any point in time. So there's nothing preventing someone interpreting the Constitution or the legal limitations there differently, other than it's just very difficult to change that kind of thing, which is why conservatives built a massive institutional apparatus to do that over 40 years with the Federalist Society and everything else. It took a long time for them to win those fights in the way that they've won them today, and it will take a long time to unwind them, unfortunately.
Bu has a question. Bu, would you like to ask your question?
My question is, so why do people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and other progressives like AOC talk as if they are not aware or don't understand MMT, to use it to help us, to we the people's advantage, to get us the things that we truly need, like healthcare, Medicare for all, and other things like that? Why isn't this being made? Why isn't this common language within Congress?
I think the sad reality of that is that Congress and a lot of politicians are not either very good at public education, or they lack the right context to do the kind of public education that would be required to change this. Because the reality is, if you start speaking like this as a politician and the ground is not fertile for it, you come across as a crazy person. You don't get to have an hour-long conversation about taxes and federal spending and put up balance sheets and things. What happens is they get reduced to a soundbite, you get parodied across the internet, and then you're a crazy person and not taken seriously. So there's part of the goal of creating a large social movement like MMT is trying to do is to change it from the ground up, because politicians are not able to educate everybody in the way that FDR had, an hour and a half of people's undivided attention every week on fireside chat. It's just not, unfortunately, the world that we live in. And so you can see someone like Elizabeth Warren, who, I don't have that much time for on a day-to-day basis, but she tried to not answer the pay for question for Medicare for all and got slammed on it. in the 2016 election. She actually tried to do probably a more kind of MMT consistent approach than Bernie did and got completely slammed for it. Now, I'm not saying she couldn't have done that better, but if you ask her to do that again, she might say, well, are you crazy? Do you want me to lose another election? And Bernie Sanders is in the middle of trying to fight a redistributive fight. And so he says, yeah, we're going to tax the rich. I'm not afraid of saying that. And, he's smart enough to hear Stephanie and say, well, yes, the two aren't necessarily connected. But at that point for him, if he goes into that room and says, well, of course I want to tax the rich, but I don't want to tax it for this reason, all this kind of stuff, he's lost half the audience. You're talking about people who have a 15-second attention span. And unfortunately, that's the world that we have to change. We can't rely on these singular politicians to do the heavy lifting of educating people. If you look at, for example, LGBTQ rights over the last 10 years, 15 years, Obama, I'm sure, did not hate gay people, right? But he was not the leader in pushing for LGBTQ rights. He didn't make it a pitch for him. And when the ground shifted, in his view, enough, maybe it had already shifted earlier and he was behind the curve, right? But when the ground shifted enough, of course he was for it. But he was not in a position to have that uncomfortable conversation with his family member that millions of Americans did to get prevailing attitudes to where they needed to be. And I think that's unfortunately the reality of where we need to go. So, it's, I think, convenient to assume that these politicians are not doing that because they're stupid. I don't think it's true. They might be wrong, but they've made a calculation. And until we understand what that calculation is, we can shout at them from a distance and they're just going to ignore you because you haven't tried to understand their thinking. And for example, AOC, I think, has done a huge amount of work to popularize and mainstream MMT, and she actually does say a lot of things that are MMT consistent. But there are other moments where she'll say, yeah, of course, we want to pay for this thing, fine, we can tax the rich. And it's like, I wish you wouldn't say that. But I also understand why in that moment, it's really enticing to use that framework to get a really big political score on your opponent. And if you had to say to someone in that one moment, hey, leave this huge win on the table right now because in the future, 30 years from now, maybe we'll win this other fight. Again, you have to understand how difficult that is to a politician who lives in very short-term cycles. It may be the right move, but it's not something you can just assume they're going to do. We have to actually convince people that this is a winning strategy. And until we've convinced people of that, they're not going to be convinced.
Yes, educating the public is important.
One of my exes, before I got married, was the daughter of someone who was running for Congress, and this was in 2016. And she was supposed to be one of the favored to win in her state. It was one of the top 5 Democrat races to watch. They thought she was going to be a shoo-in. They thought she was going to eventually run for Senate in that state. There was the DNC had big plans for her, blah, blah, blah. And she wasn't super progressive. She was a pretty kind of, down the line Hillary Democrat. But I had been dating her daughter and we had spent time with her family and things like that. And we had a long chat and her daughter said, wow, you should hear these things that he's talking about. And I talked about it with her. And the first thing she said was, I can't say that. That was it. That was her first response. It wasn't, that's wrong. It wasn't, I know economics better than you. It wasn't, oh, what about inflation? It was just, I can't say that out loud. And she was right. She couldn't say it out loud like that. She would have got a call from the DNC saying, what the hell do you think you're doing? Right? She would have been immediately laughed out of the room as some crazy print money hyperinflation socialist. That doesn't mean that she shouldn't do that, but it means that she wasn't stupid in making a political calculation at that moment. I could have just got annoyed at her. Well, you don't understand. You're part of the problem. Or I can go, okay, what do I need to do to change the world so that the next time I'm faced with someone in her position, because she could get hit by a bus tomorrow and there's going to be someone else in that exact position. It was not about her personally, right? What do I have to do so that the next time I say that to someone, they're going to go, wow, I can win on that. I'm going to win on that and I'm going to do that because that's going to be in my interest as a politician as well as in the interest of progress.
Stephen has a question. What is the short answer to how are you going to pay for it?
We're just going to spend the money. Yeah. The same way we spend for everything else that we care about. That's it. Put it on other people to explain why that doesn't work. Well, you can't do that. Where's the money going to come from? The same way the money always comes from. Well, where's that? Well, where do you think it comes from? Where did the money for the last military budget come from? Well, we borrowed it from China. No, we didn't. Well, you borrowed it from someone else. No, we didn't. We came from taxes. Where'd the money to pay taxes come from? I think, I'm not trying to be glib, because the point of my response is to try and flip it, right? They want you to act like this is a mountain you have to climb. And if you don't climb the mountain, the presumption is that there is no answer. The reality is the answer is self-evident in the question, and you have to help them realize that. You're right. The question, they have to ask the better question. I'm not saying don't help them get there, but I'm saying that the question isn't, well, we can do this and that and this and that. You just have to believe me. No, you don't have to believe a single thing. We have 51 votes, in the Senate. That's it. It's done. And if you think that's not the case, explain why.
Yeah, I try to ask questions and then lead them there through asking questions. It seems to resonate better with them. Brian has a question. Isn't the current stimulus program and federal government spending today showing how MMT works now?
Yeah, I think it's been showing how I think it's been showing that MMT is correct for years. So yes, I think there are specific things that the current situation shows were true that MMT claimed. I don't think that's about kind of a referendum on MMT. I think descriptively, as a set of axioms and as a lens for understanding the economy, and as a set of claims about how things should work to improve the current state of the economy, just see all of history. But if you want to particularly understand, monetizing government deficits debt is not inflationary, yeah, you can look at Japan, you can look at the UK. If you want to look at when there's political will, we don't ask where it pays, where the money comes from, yeah, you can look at the way that the CARES package happened. You can look at the way that Biden said, we're going to fund this from Treasury. This is a national emergency. If you want to look at how the Treasury and the Fed are in a much more cooperative than independent relationship, you can look at all the statements that were made by Powell and before him, Yellen, and all those kinds of things. So it really depends on the particular claim. You want to look at certain historical examples. But yeah, I think, certainly people who believed different things, there were certainly people who believed enough things similarly to what MMT says that wouldn't be surprised about the way that things have gone recently. But there are a lot of people that have got egg on their face or have had to revisit their mental model as a result of recent efforts. I don't think MMT educated people are among those people.
Raul has a question. Would eliminating federal taxation and instituting a universal basic income, UBI, undermine the economy, encourage inflation, and erode the labor pool, etc.?
Well, it depends on what else is going on, is the short answer. If you eliminated federal taxes and then you enacted state and local taxes to an exact equivalent level, there'd be really no difference, right? It's an accounting difference where that money ends up. So, without more context, it's hard to tell. If you said, if we're going to drop overall tax levels by 20%, maybe that would be inflationary. Right now we're in the middle of a massive deflationary slump, so who knows how long that would take. But certainly, the federal government as the issuer of the currency, it makes sense, at least in my opinion, for it to have control over the taxing side as well as the spending side. And as coming from a country that used to have independent states managing taxes and all that kind of stuff, and have basically given that up, so the federal government provides money directly to the states, I think it's a much better model in the long run. Having states issue their own currency is one thing, but if you're going to be using the US dollar, you might as well get it directly from the source and not pretend like you're kind of a household or some corporate entity in the middle, the intermediary layer. The UBI question, I think, is a little bit more nuanced. I'm on the record pretty opposed to UBI, but I think there's a couple of different things there. I think the most important point is that UBI disanchors inflation, because what you're doing is spending money into the economy and taking away the need for people to earn money in any way at all. And so the sort of core logic of a fiscal circuit, that is to say you impose liabilities on people that then require them to find access to money, gets flipped because you're giving them more money than they would ever need to earn. That's the whole point of a UBI, if it is the level that is actually going to help people live. If it's not that level, then it's not a basic income. It's just a universal cash grant, which fine, I have no problem with that. But the point of UBI is supposed to be, we'll give you so much money, you'll never need to do anything other than live on that money. And the way that I've described this as a problem is that I call it a trilemma. You can't simultaneously commit to three things. One, that nobody has to work anymore. Two, that you will give them money that will buy everything that they need to buy. And three, that the amount of money you will give them will remain roughly stable. That is to say, won't be exponentially increasing. Because if you say nobody has to work and some people keep working, fine. But the point of nobody has to work is that in theory, it should be possible for everybody to stop working and the system to function. If that's not true, you haven't actually created a system where everyone can stop working. You can say, well, we can not require people to work, but most people will work anyway. But that's a little bit different from saying nobody has to work anymore. All you're saying is soft pressure will force people to keep working so that not requiring them won't actually stop them from working. But if you had a situation where everyone in the world was super tired, had a really big New Year's Eve or something, or got really sick, and then you said, yeah, it's fine, everyone goes home, everyone stopped working. Well, you're not going to actually be producing the goods and services that everybody wants to buy with the money. And so prices are going to go up for what is remaining. And the only way to deal with that will be to increase the size of the check to keep up with that, which creates its own spiral. So, to the extent that UBI works as advertised, it disanchors inflation. And that is a risk. That doesn't mean it will necessarily be inflationary tomorrow. It could be not inflationary for a decade. But at a conceptual level, if you understand the MMT theory of where money's value comes from, it doesn't have that anchor in the same way.
I've read some of the policies that you have written, and I'm really impressed. And I want to know, how do we get people like yourself? How do we get your policies passed in Congress? How do we implement those? What can we do to help you?
I mean, it really depends on who you are and where you're at. I mean, I think, obviously things like writing a congressman and stuff is important to keep general pressure. I think one of the most important things I can say is to be, I wouldn't say an entryist, maybe more like an ambassador, or more like just embedded in more communities. And you can see this in the work that my colleagues and I try to do at the Modern Money Network, which is we have our own organization, we have our own center of gravity, we have our own brand, and even within the MMT community, we have our own way of doing things. But we are also actively involved in progressive legal circles and heterodox economics circles. And we're involved with social movement groups like DSA and, whatever else, and Sunrise and those kinds of things. And the reason we're able to do that is because we add value to those communities first. We don't come in and say, here's what you need to do to become MMT compliant, or, here's why you're doing things wrong. We come in and we do the work. Like we do the grunt work. We join the organization. We are the person that keeps the minutes in their organization, or whatever else it is, or, helps them set up their conference, or whatever it is. And then later on, then we're part of that community, and then we become the money guys in that world. And so I think, whether it's joining your local, servicemen's league or whatever it is, right? Whatever the local community equivalent is, whether it's your local school board or your local DSA chapter, or your Sunrise chapter, or, your local Democratic Party or your Green Party, whatever the hell it is, but embed yourself in more organizations. I think Real Progressive doing really important work. I think it's really important it exists, but I also think that it will always be limited in its power as long as it's only looking internally to itself. In the same way as MMN exists, much more in other people's spaces than its own. And to give you an example, when I started MMN, it was a seminar series at Columbia. I was just a law student. I just invited myself to start putting on events there. Just like you've all invited yourself to become this organization, which respect. I'm very, very appreciative of the initiative you've all taken. And I appreciate that you've done so without the kind of social privilege that being an Ivy League lawyer tells you you're entitled to do, right? Especially being a white guy like me. But when we did that, we didn't put on those events as MMN events. I was the events coordinator for the Workers' Rights Student Coalition. And I was also the events coordinator for the Education Law Policy Society. And when I wanted to put this series on, I went to the Workers' Rights Coalition guys and said, hey, I've got this idea. Would you be cool if we put it on under your label? They said, yeah, of course, why not? And then I went to 12 other student groups and got them to sign on board as co-sponsors. And I said, I'll do all the work and you guys can get half the credit. And they said, yeah, of course, why not? And then I went to faculty and said, would you be interested in participating as a coordinator, as a facilitator, as a moderator, or would your center be interested in co-sponsoring? We'll do all the work, we'll pay for it, we'll bring the people, you just get to say you put another event. Yeah, of course. By the end, it looked like, on paper, that we had 25 groups put this together, this massive coalition. It wasn't. It was us doing the work, but we gave other people the credit. And we shared the work and the proceeds with people. So if you're part of these other social groups, you can do that as a real progressive person, but you're there to add value to them and then to work out how you can get them to be on our side. Not because it's how much can you help me, but because the way you show that other people should take you seriously is by taking their needs seriously.
I just want to mention that Emma Catherine was our 101st guest on Macro and Cheese, and she talked a lot about organizing. In fact, Sarah Nelson was our 100th guest. And so I hope people will check out Macro and Cheese, the podcast, at realprogressives.org. Rohan has been on, I don't know how many times, Rohan.
Yeah,
Quite a
by now. Yeah.
Yeah.
And exactly, it's people like Sarah Nelson, right? We didn't come to her and say, your union should be helping us, right? We invited her to be the keynote speaker at the Paying for the Green New Deal event that we put on. And she said, wow, you guys are, you've helped me and given me another platform, and you really like what we're doing. And I'm, here to return the favor. And she just posted a couple of days ago, that was a fateful meeting that like a year ago now, feels like so much longer. Because that was how she connected with all of us. But we came interested in what she had to say, not vice versa. And yeah, I think Macro and Cheese have done a great job at that as well.
Tom has a question.
I'm interested in the process by which the Fed and the Treasury issue money. I can't get that straight. Someone has said the Fed buys treasuries, but then someone else said that the Fed sells treasuries. Mm-hmm. And what I'm really after is a good citation that describes this process.
Well, I mean, not to toot my own horn too much, but you can read my law review article on SSRN called Administering Money, which goes into using the platinum coin as a way to sort of explore the broader Treasury Fed accounting and all that kind of stuff. I mean, not to sort of go back to sort of government 101 here, but when Congress passes laws, it has to be executed by an executive agency, right? And typically, when it comes to fiscal spending, it will be the Treasury that will be responsible for sending that money out, right? It is Secretary Mnuchin that signs the checks, right? It is the Treasury that makes sure the money for Social Security goes out and all that kind of stuff, just like it's the IRS, which is a subdivision of the Treasury that takes the money back in for taxes. The Fed is what they call a fiscal agent. Which means it does the banking services. And there were points in history where the Treasury did its own banking services. There were points when it outsourced that to other fiscal agents, including today. Some of them are banks and commercial banks, and others also serve as fiscal agents. So when the Treasury sends money out, it doesn't have to use the Fed, and it doesn't have to use, quote, Fed dollars. So one of the reasons why when we designed Rashida Tlaib's ABC Act, which based on Mint the Coin, we used a term called, we said fiscal money for fiscal policy. And what we meant by that was when the Treasury mints a coin, it's Treasury making the money out of thin air to then send to people. And what the benefit of that is you don't need the Fed there. Now, physically, we use the Fed because sending out a envelope with a $1,000 coin, it's a bit impractical to people. So you send it digitally, you put the coin at the Fed, and the Fed gives you the amount in an account, and then the Fed sends the account to your bank account. But there's nothing stopping the Treasury from just mailing coins to everybody. The $2,000 checks that the Democrats have been arguing about could be just a $2,000 coin if they wanted to. It could be the size of a penny made out of cheap copper if they wanted to. And in the past, it was paper notes, which is why the word greenbacks actually comes from a Treasury note, not a Federal Reserve note. They almost look identical. If you look online, US note or Treasury note, United States note, you compare it to a greenback, they almost a Federal Reserve note, they almost look the same. And if you read on the Federal Reserve's website, it says we discontinued Treasury notes because they didn't do anything that Federal Reserve notes weren't already doing. It was redundant to have both. Now, it is redundant in a functional sense. It doesn't matter to you and I. They both are issued by the government. It matters for the internal accounting, and it's clearer to people if it was just Treasury notes being issued by the Treasury. There's no bullshit with the Fed involved at all. And right now, when we wrote that ABC Act, we proposed that the Treasury would also create a digital e-cash system, which again would allow the Treasury to put money directly to people without even mailing a physical check or paper currency or something. So the fact that we currently use the Fed to effectuate payments is because the Fed is the interface to the banking system, and most people have bank accounts, and it's easy to get money to people's bank accounts and is to send them physical cash in the mail. It's not because we need the Fed for anything. That's a slightly different question to how Treasury debt issuance works. And that is a much more convoluted process. I don't really want to kind of go into a huge amount of detail here, but the short answer is that the Fed, for its own monetary policy purposes, likes to keep a certain balance of Treasury securities and reserves at the Fed in circulation. And so whatever the Treasury issues, the Fed will buy up and sell and basically modify that amount on the back end. So sometimes the Treasury will issue it and the Fed will let it sit into circulation. The Treasury will sell it directly to dealers. Sometimes the Fed will buy some out in advance. Sometimes it'll wait till it's been issued and then buy some out, et cetera, et cetera. The best way to think about it, in my view, is whatever the Treasury starts, the Fed will finish. It doesn't matter. Imagine you've got a partner you live with and they love having a certain amount of your money in your account in a savings account versus a checking account. It doesn't matter which one you ask your paycheck to go into, they're just going to change it at the end of the day. They're going to go into your bank account and move it around. It doesn't matter which one you tell people to send it to, they are going to fix it on the back end. Whatever you start, they will finish. It doesn't matter what Treasury does. Treasury could issue cash and then the Fed would sell bonds that it got previously. Or the Treasury could issue bonds and the Fed will replace some with cash. It doesn't matter which one you start with, the Fed will finish because the ratio between the two is what the Fed chooses as part of monetary policy.
Kate has a question.
I guess my question was, even if we print more money and it doesn't cause inflation, doesn't it still reduce the foreign exchange rate?
So, reading your whole question when you said before about sort of have to be paid off at some point, there's two different things here. There's the deficit and the debt, right? The deficit is a flow. That is to say, the deficit is a ratio at any point in time of how much money is coming in versus going out. If you're spending 100 and you're taking back 50 in taxes, that's a deficit of 50. At the end of the day, you will add $50 into the economy. That might be in the form of debt, it might not be, but assume it is for a second. If you do that 3 times, the debt will be 150. The deficit each year will still be 50. So the deficit is completely, there's no point you ever have to repay a deficit. A deficit is just a record of what happened in a certain time period. It's like how much, to be crude, I drank a liter of water and pissed out half a liter today. Well, I don't need to sort of give back the other 500 mils. I could do that every day indefinitely as long as the water is evaporating some other way or whatever it is. So there's nothing that needs to be paid back with the deficit. The question of what repaying debt means, you just replace it with cash. And so someone was holding $100 of Treasury debt is now holding $100 of cash. The exchange rate is much more complicated than just the amount of dollars in circulation. First of all, every country in the world is managing its exchange rate against all the other countries. So if the US government wants to make its exchange rate go down and all the other countries go no, they just make theirs go down even further. And then you're back in it's all relative, right? So this is why you have these sort of US accusing China of engaging in currency manipulation and these kinds of things, because whatever one person does, another person has the ability to react to that and to offset it. But in reality, there's so many kinds of assets denominated in US dollars. Remember how before we said anyone can create money, the challenge can get accepted? For every dollar issued by the US government, there's a lot more in private debt or private instruments and things out there. And so you could try to sort of manage the overall amount of US dollars issued by the US government. And meanwhile, there's all this other stuff happening over here by other actors outside of your control. And it's not very helpful. It's sort of like bailing, water out of your pool when a tsunami is coming. It doesn't actually stop your house from getting covered in water, right? You got to actually look at everything that's going on. So to understand FX rates means to understand those swap line networks I mentioned earlier, how these countries actually manage exchange rates between each other. And it requires looking at the relationship between public and private monies, understood more broadly. It is true that a huge amount more spending or a huge amount of currency issuance can have an effect on the dollar, but it isn't some one-to-one ratio, and it isn't necessarily going to devalue the dollar in some automatic way. And in fact, spending in a way that improves your economy is going to make your country stronger, and if anything, might appreciate your currency. So it also often depends on the kind of thing you're doing with the money.
So why do some people say that mint the coin is gimmicky? I mean, to me, it makes so much sense. So there's probably an accounting thing going on there, but I don't know what it is. I mean, Mosler also says it's a gimmick.
The reality is that there are two layers here. One is that when there are different ways for the Treasury to get money out to people, but right now the Treasury doesn't have a digital currency infrastructure of its own, right? If you want money to get into people's bank accounts, it's going to go through the Fed. And there's two ways you can really do that. One is you can ask the Fed to spend on behalf of the Treasury, and the other is you can create money at the Treasury and then deposit at the Fed and demand the Fed do with the Treasury's money what it was going to do otherwise. Now, at a consolidated level, when you zoom out from the Treasury and the Fed, it's all government money. But at a deconsolidated level, those differences are real, right? There are situations where different departments of the federal government have gone to court with each other, where one Secretary of Education has a fight with the Secretary of Treasury. The fact that it's all part of the government isn't the end of the story. It's a useful layer of analysis to remember this is all happening sort of in-house. But even within a company, you can have a fight with the sales department and the research department or something. The fact that it's all one company doesn't mean that there's no intra sort of departmental tensions or differences. And so one of the reasons we set up with the coin was because if you're going to set it up so that the Treasury just tells the Fed to let the Treasury run an overdraft at its Treasury account, which is entirely possible, it's happened in the past, it would be just as much law to change as the coin. The effect of that, psychologically and politically, is it's the Fed's money. The Treasury has borrowed the money from the Fed. The Fed has monetized the debt. And that just brings you into this world of you're undermining Treasury Fed independence. You're basically doing all the things that we've told for years you can't do with central banks. And maybe some people want to fight that fight. I have no problem with that. I fought it in other contexts. We didn't want to fight the fight with Mint the Coin. The point of Mint the Coin was we don't need to ask the Fed's permission. We don't need their help on this. We don't need their infinity sign. The Treasury has its own infinity sign, and it can use that. And so our goal here was to liberate the Treasury from that reliance on the Fed. In Warren's perspective, that's irrelevant because it's a fake reliance anyway. I don't agree that politically it's fake. It's operationally unnecessary. Politically, it's very real. It isn't politically costless to just assume that the Fed can buy those things. We actually have to make the political case for that. So that's why we thought having the Treasury issue its own money was better than just letting the Fed run an overdraft on behalf of Treasury.
The point is that the Treasury can't just print money, but it, for some reason, can mint a coin.
The Treasury can print paper notes, those US notes that I mentioned before, those greenbacks, but there's currently a legal cap of 300 million. The reason the coin came into kind of popularity was because there was a point during the debt ceiling crisis in 2011 and 12 where a lawyer named Carlos Mucha, who popularizes MMT blog comments back when there were a lot of MMT blogs, who frequented those, found an obscure provision of the Coinage Act that under existing law, without changing a single law, said the Treasury Secretary can mint and issue a coin of whatever denomination it wants. So, back when the Civil War happened and those greenback laws were put on the books, 300 million was a lot of money. It was a huge amount of money, but 300 million is peanuts today. And so the fact that the Treasury can print $300 million of greenbacks would fund the US budget for about 25 seconds, whereas minting a coin of $100 trillion in value, as Joe Firestone recommended, would basically end any need to issue Treasury securities at all without even changing anything about the existing accounting relationships. Now, when we proposed it in a law, in a bill, we could have just changed the law. We could have just changed the law to allow them to issue more greenbacks and those kinds of things. But the $1 trillion coin was already in people's psychology. It was already in the popular consciousness. It had been discussed at the top levels of the legal world. It had been discussed by people like Paul Krugman. It had been discussed on TV. Jon Stewart, The Daily Show, had talked about it. And so we started with that as a very important symbolic intervention. And this is where the gimmick thing, actually, we did a podcast with my organization's podcast, Money on the Left, with myself and Nathan Tankus about this, which I highly recommend checking out, where we said, look, it is a gimmick, but it's a good gimmick. All accounting is a gimmick, and this is a gimmick that teaches something really important. And one of the things that it teaches is that We don't have to go into all that complicated shit with the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. All that stuff is an explanation of how stuff works today, but it could be as simple as minting a single coin. And that simplicity is actually a very powerful educational device. The other thing is, coins are something that people always associate with money from little children, right? Abstract accounting is very hard for people to get their head around. The problem with coins is that it usually gives people the idea that the value is tied to the metal, right? Coins in ancient Greece, well, it's about gold, all that kind of stuff. The beautiful thing about $1 trillion coin is there's no way in hell a coin this big is worth $1 trillion in metal, right? So it kind of leans into the physicality of money, which is not real, but it does so in a way that blows it up. It makes it impossible for you to believe that this coin is valuable because of the metal in it. It's valuable because of the number on it. And that's what that tension, that cognitive dissonance is productive in our view. So when we lent into the coin, we did it intentionally for its sort of aesthetic implications as much as its operational implications. Operationally, it's sound, right? It's as sound as anything else. Pedagogically, it is very, very different to, we'll just mark up the account at the Fed. So when Warren says it's not necessary operationally, but it may be valuable pedagogically in a way that his alternative is not.
And this was from Rashida Tlaib's office, the
ABC Act, the Automatic Boost to Communities Act.
Yeah, I liked her little hashtag that she had going on.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Rashida Tlaib, I love her, and she spends her time thinking about how to help people on the ground, but she's not some abstract central bank treasury operator. Her eyes would glaze over before you got 5 seconds into that conversation. We got her tweeting hashtag mint the coin. And we got Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, doing that as well. We had 25 members of Congress, including some of the most leading congressional progressives, support something. So you can do your own assessment of how valuable that is.
Will there be a need to issue securities if you have that platinum coin?
No, there's no need, but there may be still a desire to do so. So the way that we set up the ABC Act was the Treasury would issue the coin, but we actually gave the Fed the power to issue securities if it wanted to. So remember how I said it doesn't matter how the Treasury starts, the Fed finishes, right? The one caveat to that, which I didn't mention then, so I guess I'm glad I got a chance to clarify now, is the Fed, if the Fed is buying and selling Treasury securities, it can only sell as many as it's previously bought, right? And Nathan Tankus, my colleague, has written a lot about this, which is one of the problems with monetary policy is to be credible in enforcing monetary policy, you have to be able to buy and sell as much as necessary. But for the Fed to be able to sell as many securities as necessary, it needs access to securities. And in what's happened in the past has been that the Fed will call up the Treasury and say, "Hey, you need to issue more securities." And the Treasury will say, "Well, we don't need to. We've already funded. We've already got a positive balance in our account. We don't need to issue anymore." And the Fed will say, "I know you don't need to. We need you to," and the Treasury will do it. But the problem, of course, is that then that shows up on the national debt and people think we're borrowing from our grandchildren and China and all that bullshit. So what we did in the bill was we said, look, the Treasury, if it needs to spend, it's just going to make the money and spend it. That's it. Very simple. If the Fed wants to issue securities because it needs it for monetary policy or because it wants to give securities to investors who want to hold securities because they may not have an account at the Fed if they're not a bank, so they can't hold reserves, right? You and I can't hold reserves. Neither can Walmart, right? JP Morgan can because it has an account at the Fed. But Walmart, if Walmart wants to hold safe US dollars, it will hold it in Treasury debt. Right? So what we set it up was a system where basically the two roles would be switched. Instead of the Treasury issuing Treasury securities and the Fed turning half of it into money, we'd have the Treasury issue money and the Fed turning it half into securities. But it would be very clear that the Fed doing that had absolutely nothing to do with borrowing from our grandchildren or funding the deficit or anything like that. It was entirely to help the Fed achieve its own goals with respect to financial markets. And other countries around the world issue central bank securities right now. So it's not an unheard of process. And ironically enough, they do it, or maybe not ironically, they do it in context where there isn't a treasury market. Often in countries where, because of the trade flows and the financial flows, those countries run a persistent budget surplus, right? Because the money is coming in elsewhere from trade surpluses. They don't need it. They don't need to run budget deficits. So in those countries to actually ensure that there's a securities market, even when the Treasury isn't issuing any, the Fed will issue them, or the central bank in those countries. So we set it up like that. Now, I don't think you actually need that in any sort of metaphysical, political sense, but we didn't want this bill to be a bill where it would take on the whole fight of ending the Treasury market. That wasn't the point of the ABC Act. That's a sort of fight for a different day. So our bill was a way to say, look, the Treasury is going to stop issuing securities. We're not going to do that anymore because it's confusing and it's annoying and it misleads people about borrowing from our grandkids. But if investors still want securities, they can just go to the Fed and ask for them.
Hypothetically, if China were to cash in on its debt and demand that the U.S. pay back all of its money, what will happen? Is this a ludicrous hypothetical? If so, why?
The short answer is nothing. What would happen is the money would move from one account to another. It would move from the savings account to the checking account. And if the checking account paid as much interest, it would be functionally the same. There are certain properties of securities that are a little bit different from the properties of reserves. And so that's a relevant consideration. But all that would happen is China would be holding a bunch of US dollar denominated assets. And then the next day it would be holding a bunch of US dollar denominated assets. That's it. There'd be slightly different assets, but that's it. There's no major difference there. That's not the relevant political risk. The relevant geopolitical risk is that China would want to draw down its accumulated net assets and try to actually buy stuff. That's where the politics would get messy. If China tried to buy up half the S&P stock market, right? China tried to buy up half of Apple. It said, okay, we've accumulated $5 trillion. Now we want to use that money to buy up half of the US stock market. That's when you would get a lot of people go, well, wait a second, there's a national security issue here. I'm not really sure we want China to own half of our economy. And they just pass a law saying it can't do that, and that's it. There are already laws preventing foreigners from owning certain amounts of assets, right? So it's not about the money. It's about national security and domestic sovereignty over your own economy. So, but again, my view of this really is that China knew that running a budget surplus and accumulating US dollars was not necessarily the best thing in real resource terms, but it might have been the best thing for it geopolitically. It avoided a war with the global superpower while it came up behind it. Right? It managed to integrate itself into the US Western economy without becoming an isolated, Soviet kind of style basket case. And so I don't think the Chinese government is so stupid that they would try to run down those assets in such a dramatic way as to provoke the kind of national security response that would actually happen if they did. They wouldn't do that. Maybe over time they will get more powerful and they will leverage that power and then they will start making moves, but they would do that anyway. This is just, in some respects, that number that China has accumulated, to me, I think of it almost like a peace number. That's the value of global peace. We avoided a kind of Cold War or hot war that really could have erupted at different points. Now, I'm not saying that was the best way to do that, and came on the back of lower living conditions for billions of people in China. But the effect of it was to have the Chinese economy and the US economy much more integrated and much more interreliant on each other than otherwise would have been the case, in a way that definitely helped the US and probably saved China from a confrontation with the global military superpower.
I'm going to ask you one more question before we let you go, because I really like Christina's question. So postal banking versus federal banks for citizens versus spread the Fed.
I'm not sure these are really in contrast with each other. I mean, I'm supportive of postal banking. I think postal banking is a great way to do bricks and mortar retail delivery of services. I think it makes sense to have the back end of postal banking be Fed accounts for everybody and the Federal Reserve to manage that. I think the Treasury should manage digital cash as a complement to both. So when I talk about the digital financial infrastructure, I talk about all three. I talk about the Fed as the accounts, let the bankers do banking. I talk about the Treasury doing cash. The Treasury historically did coins and notes, let it do the digital equivalent. And postal banking to do the last mile service delivery. The postal service has been the infrastructure of the network of the United States since the 1700s. It should continue to do that. I don't think that there's much need to have a federal bank to do lending at the federal level. I think anything that can be done with lending can be done with grants and taxes, and lending encourages this sort of mentality of credit and of repayment and interest, which is a fundamentally private sector concept. So as my colleague Raul Carrillo likes to say, instead of lending and repayment, we should have creation and destruction. That should be the way to think. And in terms of spread the Fed, I don't agree with my advisor Bob Hockett on how to design that, but I think one of the things the Fed has been very successful in is creating a regionally diverse structure. And people have talked about this with the federal government more generally, that it could be possible to have, break up agencies so that an agency like the Department of Education has 12 branches across the country, or, put it in economically depressed areas and things like that. So I don't agree with the way that he wants to use the Fed, but I think a geographically dispersed federal government is a smart idea as a general principle.
Would you mind explaining, just going into this a little bit, about because some people don't even understand the concept of postal banking. Why would we want it? What is it that we're trying to address with one of these three things here, postal versus federal versus?
So there's different things. I'll start with the simplest. eCash, what we're talking about here is a digital instrument that functions as close to physical cash, which means you and I can transact with each other digitally using our two devices, and those two devices send stuff to each other, but no one else is involved. There's no central ledger. There's no third party processing the transaction. There's no bank in the middle. There's no accounts. It's the closest thing to a physical coin or a physical note as possible, which has incredibly important implications for privacy and for censorship, right? If there's no one in between you and I, no one can stop the money being used however we want it to use. And I think that's a really important part of what the freedom that money can bring to people is that, physical cash, you don't have to ask permission. You want to sell drugs behind the schoolyard, you can do that. You want to fund a revolutionary group to, protest segregation in the South, you can do that. Right? If it all has to go through a bank account, then you're living in the world of Edward Snowden and surveillance and all that kind of stuff. So I think eCash is a basic precondition for political and economic freedom. Fed accounts is basically just saying right now we rely on commercial banks as the primary layer that all of us hold accounts in, and then the commercial banks have accounts at the Fed. And then the way that we deal with the risk that comes with that is we create deposit insurance and we give the banks accounts at the Fed and we bail them out and all this kind of stuff. But we only do that because there's no way for people to hold digital dollars in an account directly at the Fed anyway. So if you had that, then you wouldn't need to put all your money in a bank account. You could put it in the Fed account and it would be even safer, and there'd be no need for all that deposit insurance and all that other stuff. And if banks wanted to lend, we could still have them lend, but they could be lending directly US dollar created dollars rather than insured deposits. So it's a way of making us less reliant on banks as the primary infrastructure for the payment system in the banking system. Postal banking is really about the last mile service delivery. Postal banking is, what do you do about the fact that millions of people can't even use a smartphone or don't have access to a computer? So you can't just say we're going to put it all online on an app and that'll be enough. You need something where people can go in person and talk to a real human. And there are huge areas of the country where there isn't a single bank in sight, but there is a post office. And there are places in the country where there isn't any other entity that could run that stuff. The Fed, has 5,000 economists in DC. It doesn't have or 500 economists. It doesn't have a branch in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, or whatever else. So if you actually want to make sure that people can get basic services attached to their Fed account, that they can go speak to somebody and manage that, the way to do that is through the Postal Service. The Postal Service already provides certain financial products, money orders and prepaid debit cards. And historically, there was postal banking up until about the 1960s when it was too successful and commercial banks pushed to get it killed. But postal banks exist in other countries today. Japan has them, England has them, a number of countries has them. I've used them in England. They work fine. It's not the place you go to get loans, but it's a place where you have a basic account, your payments go into it, all that kind of stuff. And if you think about today, for example, with these stimulus checks, how hard it was for people to receive them, if everyone had an account at the Postal Service, that'd be it. Very easy. In the same way you can do mail forwarding and all that kind of stuff. Your postal bank account follows you wherever you go.
You want to tell people the title of the book you're writing?
Yeah, sure. It's called Digitizing the Dollar, The Battle for the Soul of Public Money in the Age of Cryptocurrency. So I'm particularly looking at kind of this privacy angle. I'll talk about the other things as well, but other people have talked about a lot of those other things. I think the thing that I'm bringing that a lot of other people in the MMT community haven't brought yet has been the focus on digital cash and the importance of privacy there.
And this is a book you're writing?
Yeah.
So it's not published yet. Got it.
No, hopefully this year.
Fantastic. Looking forward. Thank you so much, Rohan Gray, for being with us and answering all of our questions. This has been fantastic. So take care.
Take it easy.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.